fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren.
Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
So let's pull them out here. Stephen Singular, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Stephen, what made you jump into the ballot election and doing this sort of a book?
Well, the story starts back in 2000, and what really motivated me to go at it again and eventually get it into this form and get it published was the 2016 election with Donald Trump. The key thing I thought about in that election, because it does go back to 2000, is that the polls were wrong. When the polls are significantly and seriously wrong, that to me raises major questions, and that's really where this story starts. So if you go back to the night of November 7th, 2000, the general election of 2000, and we may all have a memory, or many of us may have a memory of, I'll use one example, but Peter Jennings of ABC Television comes on around 9:30 or 10 on the East Coast and confidently announces that Al Gore is the next president of the United States and that he'll follow Bill Clinton into office. This is the first time in 48 years that you have three Democratic administrations back to back to back, and that's pretty significant. And you also have in Gore, generally speaking, someone who's interested in the environment and climate change and education and energy alternatives and all of those things. So, that's what's presented to us, and George W. Bush will fade into history with Dick Cheney. About 2 hours or so later, Jennings comes back on. Jennings made his announcement, of course, based upon polling, based upon exit polling, where people come out of wherever they voted in their precinct and they say, I voted for X. And, this is all based on statistical extrapolations, and it all worked fine in the past. And when a network, someone at that level, goes on and makes a projection about the President of the United States, they know what they're talking about. They have to. Jennings comes back on. He says, oops, sorry, we really don't know who the winner is, and we have to withdraw what was said earlier. The other networks were going through similar gyrations at that time. We'd never seen this before. So at about 2:15 a.m., now we're in November 8th, Fox decides to announce that George W. Bush has won the election. He has a cousin who's working over at Fox named John Ellis, and Ellis gives the go-ahead, and they make this pronouncement based upon not entirely sure what. But the other networks fall in line, and we're now told that George W. Bush is president. So now you have an entirely different vision of what the future is going to look like. So then, as many will recall, the lawsuit started, the recounting started, and it went back and forth. Bush was ahead by approximately 537 votes out of about 6 million cast. But the really curious part of the election was that you had around 200,000 overvotes and undervotes. An undervote is where the punch card, and that's what we're talking about here, goes through the machine repeatedly to be counted, and it looks as if the person voted for no one. So in other words, you punch out the little piece of paper, the Chad on the card, somehow it goes back into the hole, and that's a non-vote. Or, contrary-wise, as the ballot goes through the machine, a bunch of Chads come out and it looks like someone voted for too many people for president, for example, and that's called an overvote. So you had in the neighborhood of 200,000 of these overvotes and undervotes combined, and if you'll recall what I just said, Bush is ahead by 537 votes. So what went wrong with those 200,000 ballots? And that's, of course, where all the legal arguments started, all the political wrangling. And to give you one example, the Democrats in their legal fight focused on Miami-Dade County in southern Florida. In one of the precincts that I was later involved with, they voted 10-1 for Al Gore. So, and there were about 10,000 rejected ballots. So if you extrapolate that out, that's 9,000 votes for Gore that didn't count, that were thrown out. Well, 9,000 is a bigger number than 537. So based upon that extrapolation alone, you could say that Gore would have won. Ultimately, the Florida Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, and Jeb Bush, the governor, managed to sort of work together to shut down the recounting. It went to the Supreme Court, as everyone knows, and by a 5-4 vote on December 12, 2000, Bush was made president of the United States. I had a friend who lived in Fort Lauderdale, which was in Broward County, and the three major areas that the Democrats focused on were Miami-Dade, Broward County, and Palm Beach, but especially the first two. So my friend named Jack lived in Fort Lauderdale, Broward County, right at the dead center of the election problems. So after all the dust had settled, right at the end of December of 2000, I got a call from him, and I mean, he knows I'm an investigative journalist and look into weird and unusual things and have done it for a long time. And we started talking, and he told me about his and his wife's experience in the 2000 election. And what he said was that they had absentee punch card ballots that they had received well in advance of the election in October. And they did what you're supposed to do, which is to take a stylus or a pencil or whatever and to punch out the CHAD for your selection for the President of the United States. Others as well, but just focus on that. They did that, and he and his wife finished, and then he turned his card over, and he noticed that the CHAD had gone back into its hole. And what you're normally supposed to have in that situation is the infamous hanging CHAD. So you punch it through, it's partially dislodged. But what he noticed was that isn't what happened. He is a mechanical engineer. He had worked for years in manufacturing and how things are made, and he knew something about that. So we started talking, and he said, well, to finish that part of the story, he said, we went back, we re-punched out the CHAD, we tore it off the back, and we mailed in our ballots, and we never gave it another thought. And they went on vacation, they came back, they sit down on November 7th to watch the election returns, and suddenly they're watching all of these problems unfold around what I just described. In their particular case, it would have been an undervote had they not taken that extra step. The CHAD went back in the hole, it would have looked as if they had voted for nobody, and their vote would have been negated. So suddenly, while they're thinking, well, this was just a idiosyncratic little thing that happened to us, there are 60,000 to 80,000 undervotes hanging out there in the aftermath of the election. And Jack said that's, an extraordinary number. And what actually happened here? In the resolution of the presidential election, what we were told was, well, these vote-o-matic machines that count the votes probably weren't working. Or, well, the people who were voting just weren't smart enough to figure out how to push that little piece of paper out, or something else. But there was never given any reasonable explanation for why the exit polls were totally wrong. an unprecedented event on American television. So my friend said, the question that nobody's asking here, and he was asking it as a mechanical engineer, is, what about the cards? The cards were effectively neglected. Nobody's really focusing on that part of it, the machines, the people, etc., but not that. And he said, I think you should look into the cards. Where did they come from? How were they made? How does that whole system work? And, you know, I didn't quite know what to make of that at the start. But he said, you know, maybe we could get our hands on some of those same batch of cards, but those that had not been used, and sort of examine them and see what was possible. That it seemed like a real long shot. I mean, to be honest about it, this is getting to be the first week of January 2001. The Bush inauguration is on the 20th of January. And I, being an adventurous sort and an investigative journalist, and being perplexed by what had happened, because from my point of view anyway, there were no answers at all, I said, okay, I'll come down and, you know, we'll look into this and see if we can learn anything. So I did that, and we had arranged to meet with the director, or the supervisor of the election warehouse in Fort Lauderdale, where the cards were stored. That would be both the cards that had been used in the election, and which was millions, and those that had not been used. They always order more than they're going to use, but a year or so earlier, they had ordered 1.5 million cards from a company that comes out of Omaha, based in Omaha, called ES&S, probably the largest elections system in the United States. So we went down, we talked to the fellow, we asked him if we could have some of the unused cards, and really to my surprise, he said sure. And he gave us some from two different card manufacturers. The minor one in that election was from a company called Sequoia Pacific in California, but the major one was ES&S, and he gave us a large pad of those and a smaller pad of the others. And I think what's important about that is that these people, we talked to them, you know, face to face for an hour or so, and they did not have a clue as to what happened in the election. They said, you know, we did what we always do. If you can think back to that period, they were just being hammered in the media. You know, these people are stupid, they're incompetent, they're corrupt, lawsuits are flying around, comics were making jokes about them, and they were truly perplexed. Like, we would like to know what happened. And I think that's part of the reason that the guy handed over the cards. It was like, well, if you could learn something, you know, that'd be great. So we left with these cards, and we, again, Jack's an engineer. He knows something about the manufacturing of things. Inside the punch card industry, there's a machine called a strain gauge, which measures the appropriate pressure needed to remove a chad from a card. It's called bursting density. That's the pressure you need, and the standard inside the industry is between 150 grams and 300 grams. It should fall within that range. So we set about trying to get a strain gauge and trying to examine the cards in more depth and see if these fell within the range of that. It was very difficult to come up with something like that. We looked all over South Florida, and eventually Jack had to fashion his own sort of contraption based upon using a digital something to measure weight digitally. So we did that, and he began a really in-depth examination of the cards. He took photographs of them. He blew them up 30 times. He studied the perforations on the cards. He studied the bursting density, all of those things, and he began to feel that there were perhaps on some of the ES&S cards things that were questionable. Let's just put it like that. He was finding consistently it took more pressure to push out some of these chads, and he was finding that they all sort of dislodged in the same way. And to him, it raised the question of, is this something that's random or by accident, or is this something that could be, produced this way, to behave in this way? So, again, we were just in the process of doing research and asking questions, and to him, at least, it began to look as if this needed much more, examination in a qualified lab that costs a lot of money. We were working on the notion that, Bush is coming in 15 days, now 10 days, et cetera, and we need to do something quick to learn more about this and possibly get a result that could be quite important. So within about 10 days, all of the things that I'm talking about had happened. He had some preliminary results. He felt that there was something there, and we needed to do something. I had worked with a producer at 60 Minutes in the past. 60 Minutes, of course, the CBS award-winning investigative journalism show, the very top of the heap in televised journalism. And I called this individual and explained the situation, and it took her about, as I wrote, about 60 seconds to understand the implications of what I was saying. That, in other words, if cards could be created to behave in a certain way, and if they had behaved in that way, and that votes were, as a result of that, were effectively changed as the cards went through the counting machine and back through the counting machine, which is what went on in the aftermath of this election, because the voting was so close. If it's within half of 1%, then you have to do the recounting. That's what happened. We had anecdotal information about every time the cards went through the machines, the voting tallies changed. Well, how could that be? So there were an array of questions on the table in front of us, and we were finding that, looking into the cards was a pretty good idea, or a pretty good starting place. So the producer contacted Mike Wallace, the most famous, as we all know, of all the 60 Minutes reporters or anchors, whatever you want to call them. And it took him about 60 seconds to say, we should look into this. We should see what we could find out. Because, again, to go back to the original question, how could the polls be wrong? In other words, between the time that those people came out of the polling booth and said, I voted for X, and the time that those votes were counted or recounted, something changed. Something happened. What was it? That's the primary question on the table. So CBS then jumped into the story, and I was told that I had to back off and that they were going to get more cards, they were going to run more tests in a qualified lab, again, a very expensive proposition. They were going to see if there was a real story here, and they were going to try to get something on the air fairly quickly. Up until this point, I think the story is pretty clear, and now it's going to start to get muddy, because I was effectively told, if we're going to get involved in this, you're going to have to go away. We're going to take it from here, and you're going to have to take it on faith that, whatever happens here is going to work out all right. So a very unusual position for a journalist to be put into, but I didn't know what else to do, and I made the best decision I could at the time based upon what I knew. And I said, okay, you run with it. So they went to Florida, they got more cards, they took cards and they tested them, and they wouldn't tell me essentially what the results of all of this were, but it was obvious that they were putting more money into this and more time, and that they were learning something, and I think they were learning something of significance. So eventually a lot of time passed in the interim here, and eventually they came back and they said, what we really need is an insider in the industry to go on camera and to explain all this to the public, and somebody who, can be a talking head on the air. Now, I had been told back in January, February, that I couldn't have any more involvement in this situation, but over time I was not very comfortable with that. So I managed to contact the manufacturing plant for ES&S, which is in suburban Dallas. I went there. I sort of talked my way into their factory to get a tour of how these cards are made and what this whole system looked like. And I went down there, and it was a fairly nerve-wracking experience because they didn't know who I was. They were very nervous in the wake of all of the problems that had happened in Florida. I started asking questions about that. Could I see how the cards were made for Miami-Dade County and Broward? After a not very long period of time, they more or less showed me the door. But I did get a much greater sense of how this process unfolds, and what I was told by the manager of the factory was that, and this is the way he put it, this is a direct quotation, he became exasperated at one point and said, "We live in a 1/5000th of an inch world." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And he said, if you change the calibration on what are essentially these knives that are on a stamping wheel that come down on the card to cut the little perforations and make what will be the chads, if you vary that by 1/5000th of an inch, it can change the performance of how the card operates. So here I am in this plant in the wake of the election, and regardless of anything else about it, I'm being told that basically our democracy revolves around 1/5000th of an inch on a stamping wheel. And I were watching the wheels operate, and I realized that, well, even if they got dulled by usage over a period of time, that might have an effect of 1/5000th of an inch. So there was just suddenly this realization that, my God, this is what we're dependent upon here. So naturally, either by intention or not by intention, things could go wrong inside the system, and you could end up with the mess that we had. CBS, I think, had kind of come up against a wall where they'd learned these things, and I think they'd confirmed various things, but they needed somebody to go on camera and talk about it. If you recall, or the audience recalls, the movie The Insider, it's a somewhat parallel situation to that, where it's a very good movie. Russell Crowe's a scientist in the tobacco industry, and he wants to come forward and talk about addiction and how cigarettes are made addictive, and he sort of sacrifices his life for that, and then CBS pulls back and decides not to really run all of his interview, and he's hung out to dry. It's a very, very good movie, and it kind of shows you how the very large corporate mainstream media works in certain ways. And this situation, they were looking for exactly that person, and I was told, not to do anything or not to try to do anything. And that's the point where things stood at the end of the summer of 2001 when 9/11 happened. And that completely killed everything that I'm talking about here. And that, as many will recall, Bush had a fairly low approval rating, 40% in that area or something, maybe 50% leading up to that. And in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, he decided to go to war in Afghanistan and has a 90% approval rating, and there was nobody left who wanted to hear about the 2000 election. So in my mind, the point of the story is that we had a moment at the start of 2001 with all of this information, and there's more than I've laid out here, but essentially that's the story. We had anecdotal evidence of how these votes had changed on the night of the election, and after that when they got recounted, we had absolute evidence that the polls were wrong for some mysterious reason. I had looked into the absolute fragility of our voting system, and CBS, I think, had done considerable legwork to try to bring this to fruition. And it was a very difficult story, and I understand that. And much later, I would learn that they had found someone who was willing to go on camera. I think it was much further down the road, but that person wanted to be indemnified against legal action. In other words, they could be protected from being sued or all of that. The details could not be worked out, and it didn't happen. And so this is a story about something that didn't happen in 2001, when I think there was an opportunity to really get to the bottom of the problems in our election system, where this privately held company, ES&S, was very hard to get information from. They had very deep ties to the Republican Party. And there was an opportunity to really learn more about this and to figure out what actually did happen in the 2000 election. And it just didn't come together at that time. And I remember having conversations back then with this producer at 60 Minutes and saying, if you don't straighten this out, anybody could start to manipulate this system for any ends that they wanted. The other thing that happened that I haven't said is that because the punch card system had faltered in that election, the same company, ES&S, had rushed in, not just in Florida, but around the United States, and said, well, let's replace that with electronic voting. And they sold the electronic voting systems as well. They sold $70 million worth of equipment. In Florida, in 2002, Janet Reno ran for governor against Bill McBride. There were the same kinds of problems resulted with electronic voting, and they couldn't figure that out, and Reno had eventually had to concede, much like Gore had to concede in 2000. So you replace the punch card system with something that was clearly vulnerable, and I had said in my conversations in 2001, anyone could get a hold of this and manipulate it, and that was sort of poo-pooed, and then I said, anyone outside the United States, even if they had the capacity with electronic voting to do something, could do that, and they said, well, that's impossible, that could never happen. So this story sort of became dormant over a period of time. In 2004, as you may recall, John Kerry was running against George W. Bush. The key state in that election was Ohio. At 11:14 p.m. on the night of the election, he was ahead by a substantial margin, and the voting and the system went down in Ohio. It was thrown to some other backup computer system, which I think was in Kentucky. When it came back up, Bush was ahead, and he went on to win the election. And books have been written about that and a lot of other information, but John Kerry has recently written his own book and has more or less conceded that he thinks something pretty funky went on with that election. So we know 2004 had its problems, or 2000 had its problems. Then you have 2004. And the story, again, was rather dormant. But then comes 2016, in which, again, all the polls are absolutely certain that Hillary's going to win. And to the best of my knowledge, she didn't even visit some of the upper Midwest states because it was so obvious that she was going to win there. She lost all of them. So that was what revitalized me to sort of bring this story out of the cabinet and to look at it again and to say, we have never straightened out these problems. And we missed the opportunity in 2001 when that could have happened. Kerry didn't pursue the thing in 2004 because he just didn't have the stomach to fight it. And now with Trump, we have what appears to be a complete anomaly, that every poll was wrong. How could they be wrong? What does that imply about our system? I'd said earlier that what if foreign factions decided to get involved in our elections through computerized voting? Well, who knows what happened? So, and now we come up to the very present moment where the same problems get recreated in the 2018 midterms with questionable things in Georgia, in the governor's race, and particularly in Florida in two more in the Senate and governor's race. So I think this story is a cautionary tale. I think it's telling people sort of what happens when investigative journalism does not follow through and does not present information to the public that could be very, very important. And I just thought it was worth going back to it and bringing it out again and bringing it up to date. So that's what I've done.
Well, and very well. Now, what is the primary reason that these things are being done? Like, what is there like a cabal or a group of people or something in essence that makes these plans to have these things happen during elections?
Well, let me give you kind of a technical answer on that. One of the things that when I was in Florida with Jack in early 2001, we went to Broward County, as I told you, the elections warehouse there, and then we went down to Miami-Dade, which had ordered 4 million of the ES&S cards, and we tried to get more cards from them that hadn't been used, but the guy was very nervous and wouldn't give any up. As we were leaving, he said, well, there's a dirty little secret buried inside the punch card system. And we said, well, what's that? Pressed him a little bit, and he told us. And basically what he said was all of the cards are manufactured for a specific precinct. So long before they're manufactured, they know where the cards are going, they know who's going to vote there, they know how those people are going to vote, and they have a blueprint for exactly what's going to go on. So if you wanted to, manipulate the cards or tamper with them in some way, you know specifically who to target. In the aftermath of the 2000 election, the Miami Herald did the most in-depth study of the voting patterns there and the problems of anybody, and they determined that the cards in the minority and Democratic precincts were 3 times more likely to fail than cards elsewhere. So you had all of this information sitting out there. You have a voting company with deep ties to the Republican Party. You have a manufacturing branch that knows exactly where this product is going and how it's going to be used. And you have an end result where many, many of those votes are negated. And in addition to that, in the aftermath of the election, you have the Republican Party trying to shut down the recounting of the votes or the examination of the cards, because that's clearly not what they want. So you can draw your own conclusions from everything that I'm saying, but I think the overall pattern that has emerged, I think in Georgia in this most recent election, has been to negatively affect minority and Democratic voting.
Now, does this sort of how is it that you can change this then? How can we fix this?
Well, I think what would have happened in 2000 and 2001 is if this had gotten off the ground, I think you would have had very significant questions raised about privately held corporations controlling our voting system. And in that particular case, they had very obvious leanings. Chuck Hagel was part of that company. Chuck Hagel worked in the Bush White House. There were all sorts of connections around that. So I think that's one thing that would come under scrutiny that we've never quite dealt with. I think we may eventually have to come up just with a different system of voting. I think the electronic voting, as we've seen time and time again, is just very, very vulnerable. You know, we haven't stopped and addressed the question in a way that I think will get to the answers to that. I'm not an engineer, you know, I'm not a scientist, so I don't have exactly the right answer to that question. But what I do know is that 3 of the past 5 presidential elections in the United States, the very best thing you can say about them is that they're questionable, and I think that's too weak of a word. I think 2000, 2004, and 2016 border on illegitimacy. And at some point, it appears, you know, we're going to have to stand back and address the issue. I've heard of using some sort of fingerprint technology, which would, you know, might be able to be worked somehow when you go in to vote, other examples of it. But it's something we just haven't yet really come to grips with.
So now, have you ever done any polls or heard any polls on how do people feel about the system being rigged or pre-planned and things like this? So something like what went on. Do people believe in the election system now?
It's a really good question, you know, and in terms of a specific poll, it's hard to say, but what I you know, find anecdotally as a journalist is that people are very, very skeptical about it. I mean, I think that's what you saw here in this last election when Florida started to you know, have its problems, again, its recurring problems. And in both cases, it favored the Republican Party. The cynicism around it, at least that I heard, was pretty overwhelming. You know, that it's a long step from that to say, well, how are we going to fix this and how are we going to make it work? But I'm not comfortable knowing that people can, you know, manipulate computerized voting systems and do it from a distance. There was a very, very good book written on this called Black Box Voting by a woman named Bev Harris in the wake of the 2000 and 2004 elections. She's more of a technician than I am, and she talked about how easily it was to reprogram these things. And I think it's a sham that, you know, we go to all this trouble and spend all this money to have these elections, and we really don't know what the outcomes are. I don't think we know what the outcomes was in the 2016 election, and, you know, we may learn something from that from Robert Mueller. I tend to doubt that we will. I think that'll focus on money and Russians and corruption, but I think the questions go deeper than that. If the polling system is broken, what's the bottom line reason for that? Are people just lying en masse about who they voted for just for the fun of it? Or are these things being manipulated at a much deeper level? And that's the question we have to answer.
So do you think there is Russian involvement in the election process? That's
the question that I think it's entirely possible that there was Russian involvement in the election process itself. And that's what I'm raising. I mean, when I posed that question 15 years ago about, you know, what if a foreign country was able to directly affect voting systems? They know that they had access to voter registration data. We know that. But what is the next step in that? And, you know, Russians are known for their hacking prowess. So I don't understand how the polls in the upper Midwest, which swung the election for Trump, could all be totally wrong. I mean, it hasn't happened before. So again, sometimes you just have to stop and ask the right question and get an answer. I don't think the whole society has done that. And I'm sort of sitting here, you know, talking about the vulnerability of it. And we can just shrug and go on and say, well, you know, it's fine to have Trump as president, and just not learn anything of significance about this. But when you've relied upon a polling system that's been effective for decades and it suddenly just falls apart, that seems like a fairly serious thing to me.
So, what do you think the next move is? Like, what should people do? What should a citizen do?
I think it's true as with many other things. I think we have to demand in some way that our votes are actually going to count. I mean, in whatever way one goes about that, through organization or through other means, I think we have to impress upon people to figure out where the problems are and then what to do about them. That, the solution, the proposed solution to the 2000 debacle was electronic voting. I don't think it's made the system more secure. So what would be the next step here to try to return to legitimacy, let's say, and to feel confident that the votes will be counted in a legitimate way?
Wow. So now in your book, what are you hoping people take away from it? What are you hoping they do?
I think part of what I would hope that people would take away, and this is, as a journalist of 45 years, is that, when I tried to get this story to various media people beyond 60 Minutes and CBS, because when I became frustrated with them and thought they weren't going to do anything, I went elsewhere. And I remember being told by the editor of a major metropolitan newspaper, he kind of shrugged me off and said, if something like that had happened, we would know about it. And I was absolutely perplexed by that statement, because that's a negation of what journalism is. That's the equivalent of saying, if Bob Woodward hadn't, gone to the Watergate hearing in 1972 and heard about this little burglary, that somehow all those other things would have happened and Nixon would have just resigned. People need to dig deeper for the reality of the political climate that they're living in. They need to be open to hear things that they haven't heard before. I think if they read this, and this is a very small book, I just want to throw it out there. It's called Stolen Future, The Untold Story of the 2000 Election, on Amazon, on Kindle, on Barnes & Noble, and other platforms. It's only about a 35-page book, and I'm sort of laying it all out here for you. But I think if you read it and you read the details, I would hope to stir a certain amount of upset in people to realize how vulnerable and how fragile this thing is. And we all tout our democracy and how important it is. But if your votes aren't going to count, or if they can be manipulated in some way, that's an important thing. And, without getting too political about it, I mean, that's what we're living under now. If the polls had been accurate, as they always were before, essentially, and Hillary Clinton was president, we'd be having a different experience. It might be better or worse in your opinion, but I think it would have been a legitimate election. I don't know what happened here. All I know is that the system broke down. So I want people to be more aware of the problems sort of behind this situation that they're not aware of. I don't think they would know anything about this story or how fragile the elements in it are. And I think that's worth knowing about. And I think that's worth bringing into the present, because the problems are ongoing. We haven't solved them. We haven't figured this out. But this is some good ammunition for talking and thinking about it.
So, going back to that one more time, is there someone particular that is behind letting these elections go the way they go?
Is there someone behind it? Is that what you said?
Yeah, like is it just a series of bad mishappenings, inaccurate work, lazy work, bad work, or is this an actual intended plan to have something happen like this?
Well, if you looked at the examples I've given you, they all come down on one side of the ledger.
Right.
They all come down essentially to favor the Republican Party, and the particular company that I looked into is aligned with that. So you would have to do a much deeper investigation to connect all of those dots and have an absolute answer to the question, but I think it leans in that direction. And that again, if 60 Minutes, if you just go back and sort of play it out in your mind, I mean, if they had followed through on this, if they had brought out the information that I've laid out here for you, I think it would have produced a congressional investigation. I think it would have produced significant change in how the system operates. I think it would have called into question the notion of privately held companies being in control of our election system. I think it would have shaken things up to a great degree, just like Watergate did in the aftermath of Watergate, where certain safeguards were put in and certain things were put in. We haven't gotten to that point. We've just sort of shrugged and said, okay, Trump gets to be president for 4 years. But I think there's far more to the story, and what I wrote just sort of opens the door into it. And we need that kind of investigative journalism now to be going on in Florida to figure out what really happened down there in 2018. And I think you'll start to get the answers to your questions. But I don't think you can look at this and feel comfortable that it's just business as usual.
Wow. Interesting. And what kind of feedback do you get when you talk like this and have this type of book coming out?
One of the things I left out was that Dan Rather, who of course was the anchor at CBS News for, I think, about a couple of decades, and who had connections to 60 Minutes, has read this book. He's endorsed this book. The endorsement is on the book was published by an online investigative journalism outfit called whowhatwhy.org. If you go there, you could also get the book, but the Dan Rather quote is there. He said this is information that he didn't know anything about. This is important information about what actually happened back then. And so that feedback, has been very good. I think when you read the book, what it sort of crystallizes in your mind, I think everybody kind of has the feeling that something is wrong, but these particular pieces have not really been put together or come out in the way that it does in this small book. Again, 35 to 40 pages, that's all that's here. I think there's that free-floating sense of there's something wrong, we don't quite know what it is. Virtually none of us has the capacity to really understand the intricacies of computerized voting, unlike the punch card system. And I think if you read this, it will sort of crystallize that sense of vulnerability for you, that you have people in control of these systems who may or may not have your interest at heart. And again, I think of it as nonpartisan. It doesn't matter which party you're for. It's the vulnerability of it that counts. And I don't think we've quite had that realization, on a broad scale. So when people read this, I think they're very surprised. I think they're very surprised to learn about how the system actually worked. And I think they're very surprised to learn that a story like this was more or less suppressed, that it was never presented to the American public because it was going to be controversial at the very least. It was going to perhaps stop a presidency that was just getting started, and it was going to overturn this whole system of how we vote. So there's a lot there in the 35 pages that were written. And I think if you read it, you'll have your own experience of, I'm a member of a democracy and my vote should count. And this doesn't smell right at all.
Right. And Russ Baker, that's the who, why, what, why, where org. And,
yep.
Yeah. Well, fantastic. More great work for you. The book is called what's it called? It's called Stolen Future: The Untold Story of the 2000 Election, And our writer is Stephen Singular. Stephen, well, thank you very much for telling us about what you've been working on.
Well, thank you very much, Alan, for having me on.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.